You know what? We are only 3 minutes into this video. We gotta get this thing going.
Now, for centuries, knitting was more of an art than a science, but then the physicists showed up.
Hello, welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I am Carrie Crotch Geek, and this is where I spread the joy and love of making pretty things with pretty string. Whenever I see an article, a video, anything about knitting that is coming from the world outside of knitting, I am both excited and apprehensive. I'm apprehensive because I know the history of media outside of knitting and how they tend to portray knitting. Usually there's sexism and ageism and general condescension involved. But hope springs eternal. And this past weekend, I came across a video from the Sci Show with Hank Green entitled, "Physicists Don't Know How Knitting Works." And I was mostly excited. Sure, there was a little apprehension, but mostly excited. And then I watched the video. And then I watched a reaction video to the Sci Show video from fellow fiber creator Christine Vique. I highly recommend you watch her video after this. And I have so many thoughts. So many thoughts. I have thoughts as a knitter, and I have thoughts as someone who has worked in media communications for over 20 years. Hey, Ed and Carrie here. So obviously, since I shot this video, the landscape moves quickly in social media. The Sci Show did put up a pinned comment responding to criticism the video has been getting. And throughout the video, I might sprinkle in some responses to that post. And yeah, but I'm going to say, I would say 90% of this video I stand behind 100% still. Their response to me actually makes me a little bit more upset, and I'll probably follow up with a short about it as well. But anyway, let's get on with my breakdown of the Sci Show video. Just hit play.
One of the oldest knit objects in the world is a sock that's about 800 years old. It was a simple thing, a pattern of knots in the shape of a cylinder with a bend toward the end for the heel. But it was also the start of something revolutionary, a technology that could take a simple string and transform it into a useful 3D object.
Okay, so let's start with the positive here. I appreciate that the video recognizes that knitting was a revolutionary technology. Well done there. However, I got some red flags right off the bat, and we're only about 20 seconds into the video. I quibble with calling this sock a simple object. Anyone who's ever knitted a sock knows that there's quite a bit of math and engineering and ingenuity to actually create that bend for the heel turn. I don't expect people outside the knitting world to necessarily get that right away because frankly, they're used to just having socks on their feet all the time. But if you, as a science education show, are going to talk about knitting being revolutionary, maybe talk about how much engineering is actually involved, that people may be surprised by how complicated sock knitting or any kind of knitting can be. Then there's a matter of communication. They describe the sock knitting as a pattern of knots. And as a knitter, I immediately went whoa, 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 whoa. Knots? That makes it sound like macrame, not knitting. But let's be clear, I looked it up, and mathematically, scientifically speaking, this is accurate to describe knitting as a type of knot. In fact, avid knitter and physicist Elisabetta Matsumoto has been using knot theory to look at how knitting works. The problem is how a scientist might think of the word knot and how a non-scientist thinks of the word knot are not necessarily the same. But maybe as the video goes along, we'll get some kind of clarification about knots from a scientific perspective and knots from a layperson perspective. Because you really don't want to leave people with the impression that knitting, like this stockinette fabric, is going to be anything like macrame. But my biggest sort of question mark at the end of 20 seconds is you talk about an 800-year-old sock, but what sock are you talking about exactly? Because there's no picture or just verbal description of the sock that's being referenced. Is he talking about this sock from Egypt that features amazing, gorgeous, complicated, stranded color work? Or is he talking about this sock, which has, like, it's a toe sock. It has a split in the toe that we think was done to make wearing sandals and socks more easy. We won't get into the fashion choices of wearing socks and sandals together, all right? Now, if you're talking about the first sock with the gorgeous colorwork, great.
It's a beautiful example of early knitting around the 11th century.
But if you're talking about the toe sock, well, there's a big problem because the toe sock is not knitting. It's null binding. But let's keep watching and see if we get any clarification.
Now, perhaps knitting doesn't fill you to the brim with excitement. I get this, but you know who is excited about knitting? Physicists. Because by decoding the patterns of stitches that create different shapes, they can figure out how to knit all kinds of complex 3D fabrics. And I'm not talking about fancy toe socks.
Well, I think we know now what sock they were talking about. Fancy toe socks. They were talking about the null binding sock.
So in the producer's comment, they actually say they intended to reference the colorwork sock from Egypt and not the null-binded sock. But I'm suspicious because I can't get over the reference to a fancy toe sock. Best as I can tell, the colorwork sock from Egypt does not feature a split toe. Regardless, I don't think this confusion reflects well on Sci Show making sure they were presenting accurate information in this video.
Now, I can't fault someone, a layperson who's not steeped in this subject, from not understanding that this toe sock is not knitting, because for a long time, archaeologists thought it was an example of knitting, and it was only until they started really looking at the structure more carefully that they realized it is in fact null binding using what's called the Coptic stitch, which resembles knitting. I have to ask, the producers, the writers of this video, did anybody submit this for peer review by another knitter? Guess not. Guess we'll just move on.
Apparently, I was wrong to assume that no one involved in this video is a knitter. Jess, hi. Apparently you're a knitter, as is the script editor. So glad you're part of the community, at least to some degree. But I'm going to be honest, the fact that knitters were actually involved in this video is even more egregious because the mistakes that were made aren't simple errors of ignorance. Like, honestly, I'm offended. I'm offended as a knitter, and I'm offended as somebody who works in television, who in fact once worked on a show about crafting. And I was hired specifically because I am a crafter, and they knew I would bring a certain level of expertise to the topic.
In the 800 years since that sock was made, knitting has spread everywhere. In fact, you're probably wearing a knit fabric right now. T-shirts, sweaters, socks.
I appreciate the presenters pointing out that the people of this world are surrounded by knitting that they probably take for granted because it's so ubiquitous and they're so removed from the craft that they just don't always appreciate the work or the skills that go into making those fabrics. I like to read all that into that sentence, but here's my problem. What is this picture? Because that looks like woven fabric, not knitted fabric. I think this might be more egregious than when a newspaper article shows a woman with knitting needles and a crochet granny square hanging off of it. I mean, you can almost understand how someone who's not steeped in these crafts doesn't know offhand visually the difference between crochet and knitting. But to bring up a stock photo like this, it just shows a shirt and not consider whether the fabric of this shirt is actually representative of the type of fabric that you're discussing is just sloppy. It tells me that you're maybe not as excited about this topic or care as much about this topic as you proclaim to be. Okay, we are only 1 minute into this video. Let's hope this next bit is more on point.
Making these fabrics is simple, at least in theory. All you do is create loops in a piece of string and pull one loop through the next, one row at a time. You can either pull the loop from the back to the front to create a little V shape, which is the knit stitch, or from front to back to make a little bump, which is called a purl stitch.
Accurate. This is all accurate.
It's actually a little like programming, but with yarn. You have two kinds of inputs, and you can combine them in an endless number of ways.
You know what? This is a really good explanation of knitting. I love that they're using programming as a metaphor for the knit and purl. That's often how I describe it. In fact, what I usually say is that knitting is a binary code and crochet is Unicode. Yes, there are things that you can do with those knits and purls with decreases and increases to do shaping, but at the end of the day, you're still knitting or purling into a stitch. So physicists, I'm glad that you are catching up. But please don't do to knitting what the men did to computer programming when they decided it was cool. Namely, push women out of it. That is a whole history in and of itself.
But let's continue.
Certain patterns of stitches naturally like to curve in specific ways, and they do this consistently. For instance, if you make anything with all knit stitches on its front side called stockinette stitch, the top and bottom will curl toward you.
I'm sorry. I can't even listen to what they're saying right now. I am so distracted by the image that is up on the screen. The fact that it doesn't match what he's saying. I know as a knitter, we all see the problem here. And we're right back to the problem that was in the first 20 seconds, 30 seconds of the show. Your images aren't matching what you're talking about. And I know from comments, I know from other reaction videos I watch, I'm not the first one to point this out, but I'm going to talk about it as well because it is that annoying. It is annoying not just as a knitter, but it's also annoying as someone who works in TV production. This is so sloppy. So sloppy. So sloppy. You have a video and you very early on, not that long ago, maybe 30 seconds earlier, you're giving a very clear explanation of what a knit stitch is and the fact that you're going to see V's on that knit stitch. You talk about stockinette fabric having knit stitches on the front, and yet I'm looking at purl bumps, a sea of purl bumps. And again, it just goes to show that when they were producing this video, they didn't have any knitters or consult with any knitters about what they were putting together for this video, because this is something we're going to clock immediately. And this is, I think, a really important time to bring up the fact that too often non-knitters don't talk to knitters about our craft. We are experts in this. Why are you not consulting with us when you're deciding to talk about our craft? And, when you, as a non-knitter, are taking on the responsibility of educating people, not just about physics, but about knitting as well, you need to show due respect to both fields. And you're not showing much respect to knitting with an obvious mistake like this. Am I taking one picture too seriously? Maybe, but it's not just one picture. It's a sock. It's a woven shirt. It's reverse stockinette.
I want to take a moment here to address this part of Sci Show's response to the backlash. I'm going to read this line specifically. The team who worked on this episode are tireless, skilled, and dedicated, but most of them aren't knitters, so some technical mistakes did make it through to posting. In the same way that a missed yarn over doesn't make a garment unwearable, so too a mislabeled visual of reverse stockinette doesn't invalidate the trustworthiness and value of the science lessons in the video. First of all, you don't get to decide how your mistakes affects your credibility. Your credibility, in large part, is in the eye of the viewer. So, yeah, if people are saying, I don't trust your video now because of these mistakes, you have to just own that. But the other part about this, and what I'm really offended by, is at the top of your post, you say that knitters did work on this video, but then you try to use the excuse that non-knitters were taking care of the technical aspect as a reason these mistakes happened. So I stand by my earlier comment that your final video was not peer-reviewed by a knitter. And honestly, as a TV professional, you really should look at your notes process. And then there's this. We didn't know how knitting as a topic would land with our audience, or if the video would be seen by knitters who didn't already watch the Sci Show. To the knitters who work on the Sci Show, did you think you were the exception? I think comments that I make later on the video are still relevant. Let me just put it that way.
You're just like, cool, science. Sciencey people are going to watch this. Sciencey people aren't knitting people. That's the way it feels. I'm not saying that's the way it is. I'm saying that's the way it comes across. Online knitters, we're kind of extra. We take knitting real serious. I mean, we're very funny as well, but we also take our craft very seriously. Just ask Seth Meyers and the U.S. Olympic Committee.
The two worst storms we've ever had at this show are knitters / crocheters and the marching band community. I'm very confident at this point that my last breath will be, I'll just be like lying in bed and I'll hear like, bum, 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 and then just take a knitting needle to the eye.
Like, there's a reason I say, come for the knitters and get the needles. Let's continue on.
But even though centuries of knitters figured out how to make all sorts of patterns through trial and error, how it all works was mostly a mystery. I mean, why do certain patterns of knits and purls create folds and zigzags or rolls? The answer, of course, lies in physics.
A mystery? A mystery to who? Because I don't think it's been a big mystery to us knitters. I see we've reached the point in the video where modern science believes that because somebody in the ancient world didn't come up with a math formula to model out how everything works, that must mean that they didn't know what they were actually making, they were just doing. We have understood for centuries how fabric behaves. We can predict that behavior. We know that stockinette curls. We know that garter stitch lays flat. We know that ribbing draws in. We know that the ratio of knit columns to purl columns will affect how much ribbing pulls in. We know from experience and observation that the knit stitch is not a perfectly square stitch. And this difference in tension between the width of the stitch and the length of the stitch helps create some of the curl. We also know, specific to stockinette, that stockinette fabric, you have all the purl bumps on one side, you have all the legs on the other side, and in fact, there is more fabric on the reverse stockinette side than there is on the stockinette side. And more fabric on one side creates uneven tension, and that uneven tension creates curl. We also, as knitters, know it's not just the knits and the purls that create curl and elasticity. We also know that these things can be affected by gauge, by fiber content of the yarn, by the twist in the yarn, by how you block the object, and we've passed this knowledge down to later generations so they also know how to control the curl in the fabric. But this sort of talk of, well, it was a mystery until the physicists came along, really perpetuates this idea that human beings don't know how the world works until academia steps in to explain it to us. And frankly, it's kind of condescending.
Researchers have figured out that the way a fabric naturally curves has to do with a sort of force field created by all the knots in it.
I love the idea that knitted fabric is in fact creating a force field. I love that.
Ultimately, the yarn settles into the position where it's under the least amount of tension. That's why once you have made your stitches, you can stretch out the fabric however you want, but the tension in the fabric will generally pull it back into its original shape. And usually that original shape is not perfectly flat.
Well, that really depends, doesn't it? Whether the fabric will pull back into its original shape. We call that bounce back or recovery in the knitting world. Objects that are knitted with wool and wool that has crimp and elasticity will bounce back to its original shape or recover back to its original shape very well. If it's lamb's wool, alpaca is another story. Also, Angora can behave differently. And we haven't even talked about the plant-based fibers, which are very straight, tend to not have crimp, and you get terrible recovery. We all know the cotton sweater that became the cotton tunic that became the cotton dress, because over time with gravity it stretches out. Though I do feel like I have to give them a little bit of a pass because this is like a 10-minute and 15-second video. I understand that this video is trying to give a very simplified explanation of how knitting works from a physics standpoint.
We've been good at sweaters for a while. Honestly, what are we gonna do there? They're already great.
I mean, I appreciate the appreciation for the sweater. I mean, they are great.
One type of self-folding fabric is called auxetic fabric. When it expands in one direction, it also expands in the perpendicular direction, kind of like these toy balls. So it could be used to make nicely fitting clothes, but it could also be used as packaging to protect oddly shaped objects from getting damaged.
So I like this part of the video. I think this is like my favorite bit, when it's just talking about how the science is getting applied to the knitting and it's not trying to give commentary about physicists swooping in to save the day.
Now, for centuries, knitting was more of an art than a science, but then the physicists showed up. In a 2025...
Knitting is not purely an art. It never has been. Knitting is engineering. It is material science. It was invented. It was not created. People didn't start knitting for artistic expression. They started knitting fabric like all textile fabrics. They were created for survival. And I think this goes to something very general, which is an underappreciation of the importance of fabric in human history. We talk about the invention of the wheel, the discovery of fire, right? But without fabric, humans would not have moved across the globe of the earth and beyond. This false dichotomy between art and science, I think, is very harmful. It underestimates the value of crafts and skills that for hundreds of years have been associated with domestic art, the women's sphere, and it undervalues traditional knowledge. And it's so not necessary. We can talk about how physics apply to things like knitting without saying, until the physicists showed up, this was a mystery to people. No, physicists are showing up because they see value in a craft that they can utilize, that they have underutilized until now. I'm thrilled that men, women, non-binary people are taking knitting seriously and looking at how they can apply the principles of physics to better understand it. That's great. I love that. And I'm sure that the physicists actually working in this area are treating knitting with respect. But the communication in this video is really perpetuating some tired tropes that I feel like it's doing it to try to pump up the importance of science at the expense of the respect to the people who knit and who've been knitting for a very long time.
Knitting evolved purely through intuition and trial and error, but those knit patterns that emerged from generations of knitters tipped off scientists that there might be something useful.
Purely through intuition and trial and error. That's literally the scientific process. Hypothesize, test, observe, refine. This is what the scientific method was, is, even if it wasn't fully defined in ancient Egypt. One thing my husband and I always talk about in terms of sort of the rise of civilization is like fermentation humans could discover, but distillation people had to invent. And the truth is almost every type of fabric that we use had to be invented. We could discover the felting process because animal fur naturally will felt. But string didn't just fall together into a knitted pattern. String that had to be invented. A loom for weaving that had to be invented. Knitting needles for knitting had to be invented. Understanding how one loop can be pulled through another in a continuous string to create a flexible fabric like knitting, that had to be invented. If it's taken scientists hundreds, if not thousands of years to figure out there might be something useful to learn from a traditional craft like knitting, it does seem to hint at the fact that science, which is so often dominated by men, often have dismissed things because they were seen as a domestic art or traditional. And I feel like this video, probably unintentionally, has furthered some of these attitudes. Look, I love the idea of this video. I think it's really cool to look at knitting and how physicists can relate to it and how knitting, a traditional craft, can continue to inspire new innovations. Like, I love this. Let's continue with that. And there's definitely parts of the video I really enjoyed. I think it gave a really good explanation of what knitting is, how it works. I think it was really cool seeing how physicists explain why fabric moves the way it does, even if it was giving a very simplified explanation in terms of knit purl combinations. I really loved the discussion about the, oh gosh, now I gotta pronounce it, exotic fabrics. But as a matter of science education, there's various flaws in this 10-minute video. I mean, so many that I was stopping about every 30 seconds. We have the confusion of knitting versus knot binding. We have images that aren't really properly demonstrating what is being shown. And of course, we have the tired tropes that seem to point at some implicit bias against ancient crafts, people, and frankly, even though it's not said explicitly, women. Socks, sweaters, shawls, scarves, everything that we make in knitting pretty much that's wearable or even used as a home furnishing isn't just an art that we use to decorate ourselves. These are functional items, functional clothing that has allowed humans to spread across the globe and beyond into space, to the moon, and who knows where else. You know, if the current administration just doesn't destroy all science, but I digress. And as a woman and a knitter, I can't help but think that some of the tone of this video speaks to gender stereotypes about knitting and domestic arts. Like, yes, there are women who are physicists and there are knitters who are men, but stereotypes still exist. Implicit bias still exists. The image of knitters is still grandmas. And there's a lot of sexism and ageism around that image. Now, combine that with our modern tendency to look at ancient peoples and crafts as though they are somehow less sophisticated, and you end up with a tone in this video that I think is kind of condescending towards the people who have been knitting all this time. Like I keep saying, I'm really glad the physicists have shown up and are wanting to be a part of the conversation. But maybe being part of the conversation is respecting the fact that we've been here all along and we've known a lot about our craft all along. Now, he talks about at the end having a collaboration between modern science and ancient skills, and I love that idea, and I want it to be that way, but I think the tone of the video doesn't treat it as though that collaboration is between equal partners. Instead, there's very much a tone of, yay, the physicists have shown up to make this cool, and that ain't cool. So Sci Show, I think you could have done better. And frankly, if you want to talk about knitting or any other craft again, maybe pass the script by someone who knows more about the craft than you do. So that is my reaction to the Sci Show's Physicists Don't Understand How Knitting Works. And I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts? What are your reactions? Maybe you agree with me, maybe you don't, but I think this can be a really great conversation. If you have not already, please make sure to give this video a thumbs up and share it with your other yarn wrangling friends. Liking, sharing, commenting on videos all really helps support this channel, and hopefully this channel keeps growing. The growth lately has just been amazing. Thank you so much. That is all because of you sharing and liking this video. And the more this community grows, the longer I can stay here on YouTube. If you'd like to take your support a little bit further, you can always leave me a tip through a YouTube Super Thanks, buy me a coffee, or utilize one of my affiliate links down in the show notes. All right, I hope that you have a wonderful day, evening, weekend, weeknight, whenever you might be watching this. And as always, happy health and happy making. Bye.